All right, so we're going to get things started. Thanks everyone for coming. Can you guys hear me back there? We good? Cool. So this is Troubleshooting Drupal with myself and Daniel. I'm a support engineer at Acquia. I've been at Acquia for 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was at Harvard as a web developer for a little over 6 years. So I've got a few years of Drupal experience under my belt. Actually, the first Drupal conference I came to was the second design for Drupal in Boston, where Dries gave his keynote there. So that kind of helped kickstart my Drupal career, which is pretty cool.
And hi, I'm Daniel Swier. I am also on the support team at Acquia with Matt. I've been at Acquia for about 4.5 years, and I have a similar background to Matt as well, because I came to the support job from a Drupal development job at a university. It's actually a pretty good jumping off point to start from a small team and do a little bit of everything. And that's kind of what made me love supporting and troubleshooting Drupal and other related issues.
Right, so we're both support engineers at Acquia. Obviously, we're not front-end developers. We both have some development experience. And we wanted to talk to the community or put together a talk that kind of illustrated what we do at Acquia support, because a lot of times I think it's not super clear exactly how we go about troubleshooting issues. Everybody has Drupal problems when they're building a site, and we wanted to share the methodology that we use every day at support to try to resolve things. So that being said, this talk is not meant to immediately solve all of your problems. If that's what you're here for, I'm sorry. What this talk is meant to do is kind of help you frame Drupal problems and adopt a repeatable logical workflow to kind of isolate where those problems are and help you kind of form an attack pattern and figure out how you're going to try to resolve these. Ideally, we want to try to make problems a little less scary, because if you have a massive site, you're getting a ton of traffic and your site is down, that's a scary situation, and it helps to be able to stop and take a breath and really examine what's going on. And that's kind of how we start looking at problems every day. So the way we put this together is we kind of have 4 main steps that we use. So one is we want to frame the problem and really understand what's going on. We've got a couple areas that we want to try to get a good definition of. So we want to define success, want to conversely define failure, and then we want to start our troubleshooting workflow. And for us, like I said, this is the methodology that we use every day. We like to think that we solve a lot of problems. It's a lot of stressful issues that come at the support team at a pretty rapid pace every day, and this really works well for us. It helps keep everybody sane, and it helps us resolve issues.
We also understand that these issues are stressful for the end users as well, and so we're hoping that explaining ways that you can help yourself will kind of relieve some of that fear. So step 1, we want to frame the problem. What's wrong and why is it wrong? So we start with, when did the problem start? This is a very good question to first ask yourself, because it often gives you the first clue as to what you should be looking for. And then what environments or where is impacted. It could be your local sandbox version of the site, so maybe it's running different modules, which might be different than, say, your live production site. So this will also frame how you look at the issue. And who is impacted? Is it yourself? Is it a colleague? Is it an end user who emailed you and said, this feature doesn't work, what's going on? And to help illustrate this framing, we came up with a flowchart method, and I will say this was somewhat difficult to actually pin down because you can go off in all kinds of different branches, but with the flowchart that we did pin down, you're going to end up with an answer to each of these 3 questions. So we've broken it down into thirds. We start with, you have a problem. So we're going to define the duration. How long has it been happening? Is it recent? Do you not know? Has it been happening forever? Did it never work? So we actually have a quick out on this flowchart if it was a recent problem, because then you could ask, what changed recently? Yes, something changed. Can we revert that change? Yes, we can. And does it now work? You're basically done. Except now you do need to find out what in said change that you reverted broke things. Either way, this helps us determine the duration, and we can then make a note of that for ourselves. That's another thing to note. Always be taking notes, always be documenting, because you will need those documents later. So then we find out the where. Is it, again, on your local machine? Is it on a server, but it's not your live server, so maybe it's a testing environment? Or is it on your live site where potentially the public can see a problem? Once you define that, again, document it. And we're going to go on to who is impacted. There are a couple of different categories of who could be impacted. Now, if it's developers and their development experience, that usually is going to branch off into a completely different talk that we will not have time to go into today. On the other hand, if it's users of the site, are they logged in? Are they anonymous? If they're logged in, are they a site builder, someone who is building out the site or maybe editing content, or is it authenticated users can also be users from the public who are, say, logging in to browse your e-commerce site or message board, etc. Or if it's anonymous, which is often a worst case scenario because this means everybody can see whatever the problem is. But you will end this step with, you will have 3 important things to use to help frame your problem.
Right. So basically, the flowchart that we put together kind of helps identify the main categories that help someone who's going to go into the troubleshooting method kind of start and look at individual areas. So authenticated users versus unauthenticated is absolutely a very important part of that. Any one of those different areas helps us kind of narrow things down. So when we define success, for me, that could be a guy handing me money. That's always a nice thing. Want to be very clear about what should be happening. And this may seem relatively obvious, but we get a lot of tickets on a regular basis that come in and say, basically, the site isn't working. For us, it's a lot faster if we have a very clear definition of what's not working. Is it a core piece of functionality for the site that's not working? Is the site just not loading? There can be very, very broad categories of success. So it's really important to start with a very, very specific definition. When it does work, what should we be seeing? What behavior should we be noting? It's very, very helpful. What are we trying to accomplish too? That's something that's also super important. If we're trying to design some new piece of functionality for the site, it's important to take a step back, look at what we're trying to accomplish. Is it worth looking at this from another point of view? Is it worth going through another method to try to accomplish the same thing? Has it been done before? Can we use a core module versus trying to use a custom module that's been designed just for this purpose?
So we also want to define failure, or in other words, what is broken, what doesn't work. So what's actually going on? And we may have somewhat defined this when we defined success as well, but we're going to want to state it again. And then, once we know what's going wrong, we need to reproduce it. We need to see how we can make it happen again. That's going to be very valuable to figuring out why it's happening. And then we're going to ask, how consistent is the problem? And that is part of reproducing it. Does it happen every time? Does it happen some of the time? Is it intermittent? There's going to be a couple of different ways of approaching the problem if you know it doesn't happen every time versus you can consistently every single time make the thing happen.
Right, so getting into troubleshooting, I know this is a design conference, so if you are a site editor, if you're not necessarily the person who's maintaining your site, this might be the place where you've established your problem and you might be handing this off. So this is a good way to kind of frame a support ticket, which for us obviously is pretty important. This might be a good way to kickstart your actual troubleshooting. So those 3 steps that we've gone through, thanks Pikachu. simplify the problem down to its most basic form. You know, those 3 steps, that's the whole idea for that. Then we can start the investigation. So that flowchart that we showed you before, that kind of helps isolate different categories that are helpful to where we're actually going to start investigating. And then once you actually go through the troubleshooting, you want to make sure you're changing one thing at a time. A lot of times people will take the shotgun approach, change like 5 things. You know, let's clear varnish, let's clear Drupal cache, let's run a database update, let's push code. You know, one of those things might fix your issue, but you might not actually end up knowing what was causing the issue in the first place.
Okay, so we've put together some real-world examples so that we can illustrate how this workflow goes. And these are anonymized versions of issues that we've seen in practice. So let's take a look. This morning, a content editor needed to edit content in preparation for an upcoming campaign on a live site. When this editor tried to log into their site, they hit a white screen of death. And so the white screen of death is a little bit infamous in Drupal, but I'll explain it a little bit. Essentially, it means you try to do something, in this case log in, and you are met with just a blank white screen. There are certain ways to mask this white screen, but that's generally the basic what it is, which usually implies an absolutely fatal error that it cannot recover from. Bad news. So we're going to go back to our flowchart, we're going to frame the problem. So when did the problem start, first of all? And in this section, we're actually going to be answering these questions. The problem started today. Where did the problem happen? A live site to an end user who was impacted. Again, an authenticated site editor, someone who logs in and then tries to do their job.
Right, so now we go into defining success, and in this case, it's pretty straightforward, right? What should be happening? Users should be able to log into the site and edit content. Again, fairly straightforward, but it's important to, you know, get it written down somewhere, make sure we're, you know, constantly referring to that.
And after that, we define what went wrong. So we've defined success as I can log in, I can edit my content. I see a white screen instead. So now our question becomes, what does this white screen mean? Can we reproduce it? Yes, we just navigate to the site and we enter our login credentials. And is it consistent or intermittent? Happens every time. This often makes an issue easier to troubleshoot just because you do have a consistent point at which you can test.
Right, so at this point, again, you know, if you're a site editor, if you're not someone who maintains the site itself, this might be a good point where you're handing this off. You've simplified the problem, and you've got a good problem statement. As of today, user tries to log into the production site, they're hitting a white screen of death. That is all super useful information. That tells us a lot of things about where we can start looking at the site. It's an authenticated user, it's not an anonymous user. That means there are a few other factors in play, and then we can build off of those.
So we're going to start the investigation. And one of the first questions that you could ask, there's a few ways to start this, but one of the first questions you could ask, what is the HTTP response for the white screen of death? This could be significant because it could tell you what type of error, or if it even is presenting as an error. So one slightly more advanced way of doing this is to use a command line tool known as curl, which will give you back pretty much the raw HTTP response in your terminal. And if you're using a modern browser such as Chrome, you can use the browser inspector to go to the network information, right-click a request. There will be a point on the menu called Copy As. You can copy it as a curl, paste that into any terminal, and then you'll get back a whole lot of information, but what we really care about is the response.
Right, and we've got a list of tools that we use kind of later on at the very end of our slide deck. Copy as curl is in there. It's also got a link to an article written about copy as curl in case anybody's interested, along with all of our other tools.
So we're just going to jump ahead to what was the response? It was a 503, which usually means the backend is unavailable for some reason. This, if it was an error directly from the Apache backend, for example, would probably be a 500 instead of a 503. But this definitely means there was something fatal wrong. So what caused it? Well, if we have access to them, we can take a look at some log messages. And there's a few different ways you can do that. Whether you have SSH access to your server to read the actual files, or if you just want to use the Drupal UI and use the database logging module to see if the watchdog log has anything to say about it. At any rate, in this example, we reviewed the log messages. We used a command line in this case, and I'll just explain a little bit about what we did. We used an awk command, which is going to let us parse some input and then output it in a nice way. We pick which variable we want to print out. We do that on the access.log file. We're going to sort it. We're going to count things. We're going to sort it again, and then we're going to get the first 20 lines. A little bit complicated, but these are the types of commands that, for example, you can find just by searching on the internet, or even shameless plug, I guess, our own Acquia knowledge base has such things where that you can modify for your own uses. And here's the error that we saw. It's a PHP fatal error, allowed memory size of this, exhausted, because we tried to allocate this many bytes. It was in this location on this line. Somewhat easy to read, actually.
Right, so out of curiosity, I mean, how many of you guys are working in the command line on a regular basis, like looking through logs? Okay, awesome. So logging, I mean, tells us a huge amount of information. And this one in particular is telling us exactly what's wrong, right? So anytime you see fatal and error, even if you're not, a technical person, those are bad things. This is telling us exactly why it's a fatal error, right? So you only have so much memory. You've gone over this. This process is requiring just a little bit more. This is a case where the logging is, very explicit what's wrong. It's not always that clear. Sometimes you kind of have to dig a little bit deeper. We figured this is a really good example to, try to introduce that, your logging is really going to tell you the answer most of the time. So our options from here, we want to go in and want to change one thing at a time. We can figure out why that admin path is for some reason now requiring more memory. Did something change? Can we revert that change? If this is a live site and editors, are working on a campaign, this needs to go live now, we might not have that kind of time, right? We might not be able to go in and do a full diagnosis and figure out, well, here's why this is actually requiring more memory now. So we might need to increase PHP memory. We have some options for that, right? So you can increase PHP memory for your entire environment. That is going to increase PHP memory for both anonymous users and authenticated users. That's probably going to work, but it depends on a lot of things, like your server size, how many resources your server has. In some cases, you can scale up the size of your server. Obviously, there's a cost associated with that, so that might not be the best solution for you either. One thing that we recommend a lot is you can conditionally increase PHP memory for a specific path. So if we look back at that error, right, so this is happening only for the admin menu. So we can use that as kind of a key to go off of. So we can then go and we can conditionally increase PHP memory for anyone who's using that path, for admin users who are logged into the site. So when we change one thing at a time, we also want to target the kind of the narrowest base of users that are currently affected by the problem. We don't necessarily want to change things for users who aren't affected. Increasing PHP memory allocation for everyone might bring the server down. So we've identified who those specific users are that are impacted. We want to change things just for those users if we can. So we want to target them as closely as possible. So that's one example. that kind of takes you through the whole workflow. I think we've got one more.
Okay, and just to wrap up the memory limit example a little bit. So we have our options to resolve. We want to take the most targeted one, but after we do that, there's certainly room to go back and analyze exactly why it went wrong and pick the best option later. So let's go for another example. A user reports that the site is responding slowly. This is a one-sentence example, but it's often pretty much all you can tell. This site is slow. To frame it, when did it start? Recently. Maybe people have been reporting it for 2 or 3 days. What environments? Again, we have a live site we're dealing with, so this could be a public-facing problem. And who? Anonymous. So basically, anybody. And in fact, it might be even worse for Authenticator.
Right, so this problem statement that we have coming in this real-world example is kind of, it's a relatively common one because it's a little bit vague. You know, a user is just reporting that the site's slow. That's a good starting point, but we need to pull some more information out of whoever is reporting this type of problem, right? We want to define success. What should be happening? You know, maybe your site is a super robust application and normal response time is 10 seconds. That's probably not great, but it might be your standard based on, you know, what you have for hardware and what your site's actually doing. If it's a super robust application, maybe your users are fine with that. Maybe that's just the standard. It varies for a lot of people. For a lot of sites that we see, for anonymous traffic, the standard is, you know, under half a second. That's kind of what people expect to see. But we want to make sure we clearly define what that goal is from whoever's reporting the problem. So in this case, users should be able to load the site and all pages quickly. You know, even that's a little bit vague. We want to try to narrow that down. You know, what does quickly mean? Is it 10 seconds? Is it a second? As clear as possible is always good.
And we define failure, which would be the opposite of our success in this case, the opposite of quickly. In this case, we're just giving the example that it takes 10 seconds to load a page, which can be very upsetting to users. So how do we reproduce? We go to example.com, and then we navigate to pretty much anywhere is the report, but we'll use the About Us page just as an example. And is it consistent or intermittent? This issue is going to be more interesting because it's intermittent, doesn't happen every time. Sometimes I could go to the site and load it in maybe a second, then Matt loads it, gets to the 10-second load time.
Right, so when we start troubleshooting this issue, you know, again, this is the point where if you're filing a support ticket with somebody, if you have internal IT staff or internal staff that maintains your site, this is the part where, you know, you've identified kind of the core components of where they need to start troubleshooting. So the issue is right now anonymous end users are reporting the site and all subpages are taking up to 10 seconds to respond. It's intermittent, but it's been reproduced. So the fact that it's intermittent, that tells us a lot of things because intermittent issues can be caused by, you know, a different set of things than consistent issues. For intermittent problems, especially slow response times, traffic is you know, immediately where my head goes. Probably the same for Daniel. It's probably not, you know, a major server issue, but traffic can cause server issues. So there we go.
So we're going to investigate the problem. And while we did mention that traffic is a thing that our head goes to first, I'm just going to say I immediately thought of about 3 things that it could be. So depending on how many issues you see, who knows where it's going to take you first. So we start our investigation. We're going to try to reproduce. This might mean trying a few different requests since we have an intermittent issue. Now, if you're using an external caching layer, Varnish, for example, or perhaps a content delivery network, you can try bypassing it with a cache busting string, which essentially means adding question mark plus basically anything to the URL. this should give you a fresh version of the page. You could try it with an incognito window in Chrome, for example. This will effectively remove cookies and history from the equation, and if it's still slow, that's actually your best option because that means it's slow on a completely fresh page load. So then, if you have monitoring tools, you can look at CPU levels and try to look historically, go for the past few hours or even days, depending on how long the issue has been. And that's going to tell you a few things. Again, if you have tools such as Google Analytics, or if you're, better yet, can parse your logs, you can look at the nature of your site's traffic, and has it increased, and has it increased dramatically. In this example, we do see a sharp increase in traffic, whether that be from looking at our access logs, looking at our Google Analytics, or what have you. So next, we're going to investigate where the traffic's coming from.
Right, and like we said before, these are specific examples that we've seen. So obviously these have kind of a resolution in mind, but like Daniel said before, this type of thing can be caused from a huge number of issues. In this particular example, we've seen a sharp increase in traffic, right? So let's kind of dive into that a little bit more. So here's another command that we use. We use a lot of different tooling because we have some homegrown tools available to us. We've got some other applications available to us, but if you go to your logs, you can cat an access log and you can parse it and look at the IPs coming in, hitting your site. So this is a great one-liner for that. And so what that's going to do is give you a bunch of IP addresses, right? So this stands out pretty clearly, right? So if your number 2 IP address hitting your site with the most requests is 494 in a given amount of time, and the top one is 7,000, obviously, that's an outlier, right? So we need to immediately look at 46, 229, 173, 66. Something's going on with that. It could be legit, right? So it could be someone in your organization has kicked off a scan. Maybe you're doing a sec scan. Maybe you have a Google bot crawling your site and just running a very aggressive index, which we definitely see. But that's a point that we should start looking at. Even if it is bringing down your site, it could be legit, and you might need to handle that differently than if it's an attack of some kind. So we've identified this as a big increase in traffic. A good first step is just to run a simple whois from a command line. A lot of times that's going to tell you what organization this IP address is registered to. And a good follow-up to that is inspect the user agent. That's also going to come from your logs. And this actually is a specific example that I saw not long ago. So user agents are not that difficult to fake. In this case, examining the user agent for this IP showed that it was a Google bot. Examining the ownership of this IP showed that it was a Ukrainian IP address. So in all likelihood, Google is probably not running a crawl of your site from a Ukrainian IP address, right? That's just unlikely to happen. So in this case, it's someone with not the best of intentions hitting your site that's trying to pretend it's a Google bot so you won't block it. Yeah, that's something that needs to be addressed immediately.
So how do we address that? We're going to go to our change one thing at a time method again. What are our options? We can turn maintenance mode on for the site. This is a bit of a nuclear option because it's going to mean nobody has access for a while, but it does give things a chance to cool down and will often just deter an attacker because they're not really getting anything out of your site at that point. You can take actions to block the IP address, and there are a few different ways you can do that. You could do it by Drupal. But that's also assuming that you have access to the Drupal admin UI. Depending on the situation, you might not even be able to get into that. Then there's HT access rules, which will block it directly at the server level, which should be more effective because it happens before Drupal even gets involved.
Right. So that's an important thing to note too. There's the ban module. There's a whole bunch of modules that let you block IP addresses in Drupal. The problem is, if you're getting DOSed, Drupal still has to bootstrap in order to block a module. So conceivably, even if you have an IP address blocked via a Drupal module, it can still take you down because Drupal is still bootstrapping and it's still putting load on your server.
So this snippet that we have included here is a pretty basic example that we took directly from Acquia's documentation, which is why you see the word AH client IP. That's a variable that gets set on Acquia hosting, but there are similar snippets you can use if you're hosted elsewhere. So we're just setting this IP. This IP gets denied from that IP. And that's basically going to drop all requests from it, and they will show up as access denied requests in the access log. And option number 3, if you have it, you could route your traffic through a CDN, content delivery network. It's even better if that has a web application firewall component, because usually you can block by IP, block by country, block by pattern, etc.
So just to jump in there real quick, the content delivery network thing, I kind of feel like that should just be a standard for most websites at this point. There are a lot of major content delivery networks out there that offer a free option, and really there's no reason not to route your traffic through, even just the free option if you're a very budget conscious shop, because they'll do a lot of blocking and they'll make sure that some of these attacks don't actually come down to your servers. Yeah, it's really a good standard thing to do.
Okay, so in this case, the IP of that is pretending to be Google gets blocked, the site gets fast again, everybody's happy.
Right.
All right, so that's just two basic examples. We could go into many more, but here's just a review of the troubleshooting process that we've laid out here. We want to frame the problem. That's what we have our flowchart for. And then we want to define what works, or what it looks like when it works. And then we define what's broken, when is it broken, who is it broken for. We ask all the questions. After this gives us a great problem statement that we can take into the troubleshooting phase.
Yeah. Yeah, so this might seem, like a very obvious method of troubleshooting an issue. I hope that it does. This is valuable for us because this is kind of the process that, like I said, we follow behind the scenes whenever we get a support ticket. And we feel like, this process would help a lot of people that file support tickets or that, have nothing to do with Acquia and just have a Drupal site or any website really. It's just a good logical methodology that works well for us. So that's what we have here. We just wanted to go through that methodology and also illustrate some of the tools that we use. Drush obviously is fantastic for many obvious reasons. Sumo Logic is a tool that we use internally.
It basically is a log collector, and there are several like it. In fact, I'll just mention a few of the things on this list are subscription-based, and your organization may or may not have access to them. Such as SignalFX, which is for servers, New Relic, which is for your application. Curl comes with pretty much anything that has a command line. I think you can even use it with Windows, but I would need to confirm that. We mentioned copy as curl.
For those of you who do not necessarily use a command line, I know most of you do already. If you are a Windows user or if you're a Mac user, obviously you have the shell that you can jump right into. If you don't use Drush and you want to try it out, you can download Dev Desktop, and that is installed, and there's a button where you can just open a shell and try things. If you don't use Drush regularly, I strongly encourage you to even just try clearing Drupal cache with Drush whenever you need to do that. It saves a lot of time. It makes things so much easier. So it's a good thing.
We also mentioned our Acquia documentation, which isn't just for Acquia products. There's the support knowledge base section of that involves general best practices for running your Drupal site wherever you're hosted.
Right. So another, I guess, tidbit about Acquia documentation. As you might imagine, Acquia documentation has a lot to do with Acquia products. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that there is also a separate article base in there. So support engineers like me and Daniel, all of our colleagues, when we encounter support tickets with some issues that other customers might benefit from hearing about and seeing a clear resolution, we're encouraged to write articles about that. And those get published to, I think it's support.acquia.com now.
Correct.
Yep, so that just changed recently, but it's searchable at docs.acquia. So again, this is not just for Acquia customers. These are issues that we've encountered. We have a pretty clear process of stating an issue, stating a workflow, and then stating a resolution. So if you're not an Acquia customer and you're running into an issue, you can't find documentation about it online, it's not a bad place to look because there's a lot of documents there, and we've encountered a lot of issues that we publish online.
And there's numerous Drupal modules you can use to troubleshoot. We just named a couple, including Devel and Solar Devel, which essentially give you a lot of debugging information. And
yeah, huge plug for Solar Devel. So one of our colleagues wrote Solar Devel. I believe Alejandro wrote Solar Devel.
Or at least worked on it.
Yeah. So Solar Devel is great for D7, and that is super, super helpful if you're using Solar for search. If you want to know why search ranking isn't quite where you want it to be, Solar Devel for D7, and it's built into Devel for D8. It helps you identify, what's actually happening with your results. So you can look at the order that things are in. You can look at, why a particular result is coming up in your results. You can figure out why a particular result is not coming up in your results. It's kind of our go-to tool for any issues related to Solar.
all right, and that's most of what we had. I'm Daniel Swier. This is my colleague Matt Farineau, and if you have any questions, we're glad to take them now.
Yeah, I hope this was helpful for everybody. I know, like I said, it should be kind of obvious, the workflow, but we thought it'd be helpful. Yeah, please go ahead.
I just have a good question. Great talk, by the way, but quick question about how do you guys handle or recommend handling the whole dependency management? We updated this module, now something blows up and doesn't work well. Maybe with different distributions like Lightning, for example.
Yeah.
And do you guys recommend anything for regression testing tools?
Okay, so I believe this microphone isn't picking up the question, so I'll just repeat that. The question was dependency management, and do we recommend any regression testing tools, or what happens when a module depends on another module and then that module breaks? Did I get that right pretty much? Okay. So that tends to be more of a development methodology question that support isn't always equipped to answer. But what I can say is that this goes directly into our change one thing at a time thing, in that when you are enabling, say, a suite of modules, you should enable them one at a time. Now, I do understand if you have dependencies, sometimes you have to enable 5 at a time, and that makes it slightly trickier. And to your point, you mentioned Lightning. We know that sometimes upgrades to that can be a little bit strange because of the composer dependencies, etc. And again, that's a lot down to individual developer preference how they handle that, and we don't have one fully recommended way of doing it.
Yeah, I would say anything you can do to really simplify things. Maybe spin up just a vanilla site and, go with just that module and its dependencies. Figure out if it's an issue with those dependencies, if it's an issue with the rest of your modules on the site. Try to reduce the complexity of it as much as possible. But yeah, it's very situationally dependent. Anybody else? Cool. All right, well, thanks everyone.